everyone. We will give everyone about a minute or two to hop on, and then we will begin. Good evening. In a minute to be respectful of everyone's time. So good evening, everyone. We're going to have more people join us, but to be respectful of everyone's time, I want to begin. Welcome to today's program. My name is Laura, and I'm with the SMU Tower Center. A little bit about how today's going to go. I'll introduce our moderator and commentator, and then our moderator will introduce our distinguished speaker. We will have room for Q&A at the end, so please, if you have any questions, enter them in the chat box or in the Q&A, and then our commentator will close out today's program. So it is my pleasure to introduce our commentator, Kovan Barzani. He is an SMU graduate, and he was part of the first cohort of the Helen Capital Management Tower Scholars. Our moderator today is Pab Jyoti Kastiria. He is an associate professor of finance at the Cox School of Business. His research interests include financial intermediation, international finance, and fixed income, with a particular focus on trading behaviors of institutional investors and their impact on asset prices. So, Pab, I'll turn over to you.
All right, thank you so much. So it is actually an honor and it's very exciting to get to introduce Professor Barry Eichengreen, who I had never met until today, but whose work I have read extensively used in my research and also my teaching. Professor Barry Eichengreen is a George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Chair and Distinguished Professor of Economics at University of California at Berkeley, where he has taught since 1987. He is also a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research, or CPR. He has also held several significant positions in the academic and policy circles. Professor Eichengreen is one of the top economists in the areas of monetary and international economics. His work has been published in numerous top economic and finance journals. Professor Eichengreen has also written several books in defense of public debt, which he will talk about today. And one of my favorite books of all time, The Exorbitant Privilege, The Rise and Fall of the Dollar and the Future of International Monetary System. So, without any delay, let me turn over to Professor Eichengreen.
Pab, thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you to the Tower Center for the invitation. Let me start with an apology. I'm at home on the West Coast in the Berkeley Hills, looking west towards San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate, and the sun is going down. So one side of my face is going to be illuminated for the next while to a much greater extent than the other side. And given the time of day there and lack of blackout shades, there's nothing I can do about that. Mm-hmm. I can relieve you maybe a little bit of the tension by sharing my screen. So In Defense of Public Debt is co-authored with Asma El Ghanemi, who's at the IMF, with Rui Esteves, who's at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and with Chris Michener, who is at Santa Clara University. We started this project before COVID, but COVID provided some, how should we put it, additional motivation. Actually, motivating the topic is not hard. I saw this headline in USA Today about 10 days ago. Now, sound the alarm. National debt hits $30 trillion as economists warn of impact for Americans. And this one, same day, from the New York Times, the borrowing binge, which many economists viewed as necessary, has left the nation with a debt burden so large that the government would need to spend an amount larger than America's entire annual economy in order to pay it off. And some economists contend that the nation's large debt load is not unhealthy. So I'm gonna come down on the somewhere between healthy and not healthy. Let me explain. I'm going to do that by trying to put the current public debt situation in historical perspective. And in doing that, I'm going to focus on European history. It's unfashionable to be Eurocentric these days, if you're a historian. Global history is all the rage, but public debt history is necessarily Eurocentric because the early history of public debt is European. Public debt appears first in Europe, really in the 13th and 14th centuries, because war was especially prevalent in Europe. The European continent was divided up into hundreds of princely kingdoms. I show you the political map circa 1200 on the right. Some no more than small cities with modest hinterlands. And this political geography reflected Europe's physical geography as a continent, as a landmass divided up by mountain ranges and river valleys, which made central control of a large territory by a single dynasty or king impractical. So with these different territorial states butted up against one another, they not infrequently launched offensive and defensive wars, and they had to borrow. They had to issue public debt in order to mobilize all available resources to defend the kingdom and survive. So the obvious contrast here is with China. China, to a first approximation, is a great plain east of the Himalayas. So I show it to you at the bottom on the right, which meant that the Qing were able to establish a unitary state already 2,300 years ago. They were able to build a great wall to keep out invaders from the north. They didn't have to fight civil or foreign wars with anything approaching the frequency of European states. And it followed they didn't have to borrow to anything resembling the same extent. Sovereign borrowing by Chinese dynasties begins really only in the 19th century AD, some 2,100 years later than some, take it back, some 600 years later than in Europe. It wasn't all easy from the Europeans' point of view. Sovereign borrowing by the king or the sovereign or the state was subject to commitment problems because the king or the sovereign was the supreme earthly power. He personally embodied the state, as Louis XIV, the Sun King, famously reminded his subjects. The irony being that this unlimited power limited the king's ability to borrow because there was no higher power to prevent him from reneging on his financial obligations. So it followed that bankers and publics were reluctant to lend to kings who could unilaterally default on their debts. So they lent only for relatively short periods of time and high interest rates. It follows that this commitment problem, along with a set of other economic and financial problems, had to be solved for a significant market in public debt to emerge. So you see this, you see sovereign debt levels begin to rise toward the levels we see today, only with the creation of political checks and balances, only with the creation of representative assemblies in which the creditors sat, representative assemblies that were empowered to oversee tax collection, approve or veto increases in government spending, and authorize or not authorize public debt issuance. This happens first in compact city-states in places like Florence, Genoa, and Venice, where it's possible to get all the creditors together and literally in one room, to convene the assembly in one room. It's harder to get people together in territorial states, but you see this same evolution with the Glorious Revolution in England in the 17th century with the establishment of an Estates General, a Republican Assembly in the Netherlands about the same time. And as those checks and balances are put in place, borrowing costs for the sovereign begin to come down because unilaterally reneging on the debt becomes harder. I show you on the right the case of Holland from 1600 to 1750. Look how dramatically the real cost, nominal interest rates adjusted for inflation, real interest rates on sovereign debt came down over the period from more than 8% to less than 2%. This is the period in which sovereign debt, public debt, comes to be recognized as an obligation of the state rather than an obligation of the individual occupying the throne. And it follows from that that those obligations will outlive that one mortal individual and that investors can be expected to continue to be paid back, see their debts serviced, even after the occupant of the throne passes on. Over time, we've seen the uses of public debt evolve. So financing wars, which is what I described a moment ago when I was analyzing the genesis of markets and public debt. Financing wars has always been of premier importance. So I remind you of your US history on the right, and I show you the debt to GDP ratio, federal government debt to GDP on the vertical axis. And you can see how US public debt history has been punctuated by wars, by the War of 1812, by the US Civil War, by World War I, and by World War II. Public debt has always been issued to meet public health emergencies. So the Italian city-state of Siena issued public bonds to deal with the public health emergency, which was the Black Death, the plague in the 15th century. So too did Venice. However, then starting in the 19th century, you see governments begin to borrow for other purposes. They begin to borrow in order to invest in productive public infrastructure, meaning the roads, railways, ports, urban lighting, sewer systems associated with urbanization, industrialization, and modern economic growth. You also begin to see states borrowing to finance social programs. So you'll notice here an increase in the debt to GDP ratio in the United States in the 1930s, when new social programs, unemployment insurance, others began to be financed in response to that economic crisis. So I have been arguing that there are good reasons why sovereign states borrow in order to defend themselves and to survive, to meet public health emergencies, to finance productive infrastructure that translates into additional economic growth in the future. But while responsible states borrow in order to meet emergencies, they also need to enhance or restore that capacity to borrow once the emergency has passed. So I think we've learned in the last 15 or so years that emergencies happen. They happen more frequently than we had thought previously, these black swan events. There will be another emergency. There will be another novel coronavirus or another financial crisis or a climate-related disaster or a geopolitical event. It doesn't take much imagination to know what I'm talking about here. Given that events of this sort are undoubtedly coming down the road, prudent governments need to start thinking now about restoring their ability, enhancing and restoring their ability to borrow. So with that in mind, we look in the book at a number of historical episodes where governments have done just that, where they have engaged in debt consolidation, where they have brought down the debt to GDP ratio, where they have enhanced or restored their capacity to borrow. So the question is, how did they do that? Let me show you some historical examples. And I'm going to do that by using the economist's standard decomposition of drivers of public debt. What is responsible for changes in public debt indebtedness over time? Well, three things. The change in the debt to GDP ratio between now year zero and year t, time t in the future, that's on the left-hand side. That depends on three things. Whether the government can run budget surpluses and use the excess revenues to retire debt. Here, I'm talking about primary budget surpluses because I'm going to net of excluding interest payments on the debt because I'm going to account for those separately, namely in the second term. So the second term is the interest rate growth rate differential interacted with, multiplied by the inherited debt. So if the interest rate on existing debt is high, that's going to be expensive. You're going to have to pay it. You're going to have to borrow, everything else equal, and indebtedness will go up further. On the other hand, if you're growing the economy, you are growing the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio. So this difference, the difference between the interest rate on the debt and the growth rate of the economy, is a second critically important determinant of how debt indebtedness evolves over time. And the third term is, for want of a better descriptor, everything else. It's things like debt defaults and write-downs and restructurings and exceptional off-budget spending that has to be financed. It's called the stock flow adjustment, SFA, because it's everything else that has to be added in to reconcile the change in the stock of debt on the left, D sub t minus D sub d 0, and the flows of primary surpluses and interest rate growth rate differentials. So everything else goes into this third term. So in a moment, I'm going to put that equation to work in a series of historical cases. The cases I have in mind include this one. This is Great Britain after the Napoleonic and French Wars, which ended around 1819. Britain came out of those wars incredibly and heavily indebted with a debt to GDP ratio. Look at the left-hand scale, on the order of 200% of GDP, twice what we in the United States have today relative to the scale of our economy. And it essentially retired that debt. It brought that debt to GDP ratio down to 10% over 9 decades. It did that by running budget surpluses, primary budget surpluses, year after year after year for fully 9 decades, with the exception only of the Boer Wars in South Africa in 1901, 1902. It did it partly because the franchise was limited. Only creditors, men of property, could vote, despite 2 reform acts broadening the franchise modestly in the 19th century. Other groups that might have wanted more public spending couldn't push back against the creditors whose priority was servicing and retiring the debt. So the subtext here is, do you think we in the United States can do this today? Do you think in our polarized political environment, we can run budget surpluses year after year after year for fully 9 decades? This case is our own United States in the half century after our Civil War. So the federal government came out of the war less heavily indebted than Britain, but with a debt to GDP ratio of 30%. And we extinguished that debt. We retired essentially all of it by the eve of World War I. And we did that by running primary budget surpluses year after year after year for 5 full decades, with the sole exception of the Spanish-American War, a couple of years. How did we do that? Because of the politics of the time. Strong creditor influence. The bankers and their ilk were very influential politically. So if you know your US history and the first populist revolt and William Jennings Bryan in 1896, they were pushing back against the bankers and the railroad magnates. The populists didn't win. Bryan didn't win the election. In addition, Southern states were opposed to expansive federal spending because they didn't want their social system to be tampered with by the federal government. So it has been said by many people who haven't looked at the data that the US outgrew its Civil War debt by growing the economy, because we grew our GDP per capita and we accepted waves of immigrants. We did grow our GDP per capita. We did accept waves of immigrants, but actually the interest rate was higher than the growth rate of the economy. And the growth rate interest rate differential did not contribute positively to debt retirement. So let me show you that in the form of that. And finally, there's a case of France, which retired the debt it inherited from the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 of about 90% of GDP by running primary surpluses year after year after year for fully 2 decades. So here I use that same equation that I showed you before, and I ask, how did, for example, France succeed in reducing its debt to GDP ratio from 95% in 1896 to only 44% in 1913? And the answer is almost entirely exactly by running primary budget surpluses year after year after year for 2 decades. The growth rate, interest rate differential contributed nothing to debt retirement, and the stock flow adjustment contributed epsilon, as an economist would say, almost nothing. Look at the case of the United States. So how did we essentially extinguish the starting level of debt of 30% of GDP? The growth rate, interest rate differential contributed negatively to that. As I said before, more than entirely, we did it by running primary budget surpluses year after year after year for half a decade. And finally, you can see that this was true of Britain as well. Primary surpluses for 9 decades. The British economy grew slowly by 19th century standards. It was an early industrializer, mature by that time. So the growth rate, interest rate differential made a big negative contribution, although not big enough to offset debt retirement through primary surpluses. If you have acute eyesight, you will also have noticed this number, and that's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister Goshen's debt conversion operation in 1888, when he bought back debt that was trading above par. He could buy back at par given the bond contracts, and he saved the Exchequer a lot of money. We also analyzed some other cases in the book that you wouldn't want to emulate, like Germany after World War I, comes out of World War I with a debt to GDP ratio of 100%, just like the United States today. And it liquidates that debt through hyperinflation. It erodes the purchasing power of that debt by running a terrible hyperinflation in 1921-23. So that ended up saving the government a lot of money on debt service, but with two very unfortunate legacies. Number one, very high borrowing costs for the German federal government, the Reich, in the second half of the 1920s, and political polarization leading to the political disaster, which was the rise of the National Socialists in the 1930s. So obviously, no one wants to go there. And finally, we look at the period after World War II, where a wide variety of advanced countries, and I list them in the appendix to this table, were able to reduce their inherited post-World War II debts very considerably. So the simple average for all these countries is that debt to GDP started at about 100%, and it was reduced to about 20% of GDP over a period of 2 decades by running primary budget surpluses, by successfully growing the economy, and by keeping interest rates down through regulation and other things. So again, this would be a very happy outcome for the United States. We're starting now, like these countries started then, with a debt to GDP ratio of about 100%. If we could bring that down over the next 2 decades to 20%, wouldn't that be nice? Do you think we could do that given our politics? So another co-author of mine, Ugo Kanitsa, and I looked at this question of who can run primary budget surpluses, big ones, for extended periods of time in an earlier paper. And we found only a small handful of countries that were able to, for example, run primary budget surpluses of at least 5% of GDP for as long as 10 consecutive years. And we went back to the late 1960s. So we looked at a lot of countries over half a century and more. And we found exactly 3 countries that had succeeded in doing that, running primary budget surpluses of at least 5% of GDP for as long as 10 consecutive years. They were countries in very special circumstances. Norway discovered immense amounts of oil and gas in the North Sea and wanted to salt that money away for future generations rather than spending it all on current programs. Singapore has an impeccably strong technocratic government, not subject to popular pressures, and a very volatile economy. If you look at the volatility of its growth, it's quite amazing. So again, they wanted to put away the equivalent of an economic war chest of funds in their sovereign wealth funds, which they did after 1990. And Belgium, as a founding member of the European Economic Community, was desperate to get into the euro area on its foundation in 1999. It had the highest debt to GDP ratio in Europe, higher than Italy, higher than Greece. And yet, and so it ran big primary budget surpluses to impress its European community partners that it would be a reliable member of the Eurozone. The US doesn't benefit from any of those special circumstances, if you will. What about inflating away the debt? So nobody wants hyperinflation, but there are some who want or forecast higher inflation than we've seen in the past. So Charles Goodhart in the UK argues that an inflation rate of 5 or 10% is likely coming, and that this will be a useful way of raising the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio and lowering the debt burden. I'm skeptical because I think there would be an awful lot of pushback from aggrieved bondholders. I'm skeptical because I think stability culture is deeply ingrained in the Fed. So I'm aware that there's debate at the moment about whether our inflation is transitory, whatever that means, and whether the Fed really means it when it says it's going to bring inflation down toward 4, 3, 2%. I'm convinced they will. So I've given you a forecast. The first rule of forecasting is give them a forecast or give them a date, but never give them both. I don't know when the Fed will do that exactly, but I think it will do that. And the US is different from Professor Goodhart's country, the UK, in that their debt is on average 14 years to maturity, where our debt is only 5 years to maturity on average. So bondholders can pretty quickly renew the maturing debt at higher interest rates if inflation goes up. So for the United States, for a combination of political, institutional, and financial reasons, I don't think this is going to happen. What about growing our way out from under the debt burden as advanced countries successfully did in the third quarter of the 20th century? That's what Europe is hoping to do with its 850 billion euro recovery fund. That's what the Biden administration is hoping or hoped to do with its Build Back Better infrastructure plan. So the argument would be that those initiatives and organizational change, technical change, accelerated by COVID, can help us grow out from under the crisis. So COVID has led to lots of changes like Zoom and telehealth and online banking and work from home that will enable us to boost our productivity. If you look at the data, there's no evidence of that. So there are changes in output per worker depending on whether service sector workers are laid off or whether they're rehired, things like that, but no evidence in the data yet of durable increases in productivity growth and GDP growth. And I would argue that's not surprising, that digitization, which is what COVID is supposed to have accelerated, is a general purpose technology that needs to be applied by firms all over the economy, which are going to have to reorganize how they do business to exploit those technologies. And that reorganization takes time. It took time with the personal computer. It took like 20 years before the computer showed up in the productivity statistics. It took 20 years with the internal combustion engine. Productivity growth in the United States went down in the first 2 decades of the 20th century before going up in the 1930s only, really. And productivity growth in Britain went down in the first decades of the steam engine before eventually turning around when firms reorganized how they did business. So maybe there will be faster growth in the 2030s or 2040s, but that won't help us with our immediate debt problems. So I conclude, last slide, there are no simple solutions to our debt inheritance. There is a case for debt consolidation now because there will be another emergency requiring deficit spending and debt accumulation coming down the road. What does history tell us about how to do that? History shows that countries that have successfully addressed problems of debt sustainability without encountering major economic, financial, and political problems have done so by turning to fiscal restraint, budget balance, or even better, primary surpluses when the time is right, by growing their economies and by avoiding deflation, or maybe even running modest 2-3% rates of inflation. But any one of these 3 avenues is not going to cut it. The problem has to be addressed from all 3 angles, given the magnitude of the problem we now face. So thank you for the attention, and I'm happy to take questions. I see there is stuff in the Q&A in the chat and online.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Eichengreen. And Yes, before we go to those questions, maybe I'll ask a couple of questions to start, and then maybe the audience and Kovan can kind of join in a little bit later. So there's an idea that, because the debt is a stock measure and the GDP is a flow measure. And so comparing debt to GDP may be somewhat misleading because it would depend on, the amount of debt service that you actually make on a year-to-year basis. And there are a group of economists who would argue that with the interest rates that we have now, this amount of debt that a lot of us are worried about wouldn't be a problem, because it's still relatively small in terms of interest service payments compared to the GDP. So what do you think of that? And I guess that's related to the second component, the differential between the growth and the debt as to whether or not it would help in the long run. Yeah.
Right. So there are a variety of different formulations, approaches, equations that economists use to think about how burdensome the debt is. And I think you're referring to Larry Summers and Jason Furman, who are the most recent people to try to look at real interest payments as a measure of that burden. I think that measure tells you about the current situation, but it doesn't tell you anything about the future, because that interest payment, those real interest payments can go up or down depending on what happens to nominal interest rates and inflation. The same is, of course, true about my measure, that debt to GDP doesn't tell you anything about the future interest rate either. But I think it does tell you something about how vulnerable the financial situation is to a given change in the interest rate. If the debt burden is much heavier, a given change in the interest rate will have a much larger impact on the public finances. So I prefer my old-fashioned version, but these different approaches share the view that we have to worry about the future path of interest rates either way when we think about debt sustainability. The IMF has a fancy toolkit to do that when it does debt sustainability analyses for its members for program countries. It does kind of a fan chart or a series of sensitivity analyses given different scenarios for the interest rate. And I think that's a useful exercise as well. From my point of view, I do think that there are a variety of reasons to worry about the trend we have seen in the last couple of decades of interest rates in the US gradually trending downward, now beginning to turn around. If global savings rates begin to decline, if capital spending for the next years is going to be strong, as most people think, as firms catch up and they build more just in case related capacity due to demographic changes. So I think we are going to look forward to a higher interest rate environment either way.
That's very interesting. And you mentioned many times in your talks, you kind of more like asking question, right? About given our political system, do you think we can do this, right? So run, primary budget surplus, or, to sort of do something like call a debt or something like that, like what the Great Britain did in the past, right? In terms of the stock flow adjustment. What would be your thoughts on, how we can sort of reduce this debt, or at least make it more sustainable, given our political system that we have today in the US?
Yeah, so I again observed that running primary budget surpluses, growing the economy, keeping real interest rates down, maybe with a modest dollop of inflation as part of that last element, are the only things one can do, short of outright repudiation of the debt, which no one wants to happen and no one thinks could happen in the United States. But the issue is, can we run those primary budget surpluses given our political system? And by posing the question the way I did, I think I answered it. Ugo Panizza and I looked at which countries were better able to run primary budget surpluses for extended periods. And the answer is countries with broad-based encompassing coalition governments, where the parties were not too far apart, and whether they either sat together in a government or worked together closely. So I would contrast two cases: the United States, where there are two parties that are poles apart on everything, if you will, and where it's hard to imagine them coming together in agreeing on whose taxes to raise and whose public spending programs to cut to deliver these primary surpluses, versus Germany, where they have an electoral system where it's not first past the post. It's not a party with the most votes wins everything, but you end up with a parliament with half a dozen parties, and in order to form a government, parties have to agree to work together, and there are incentives to move toward the middle. Which country, the United States or Germany, has the big budget deficit? So I see our electoral problem, I see gerrymandering, I see the role of money in finance, I see the echo chamber of social media, all as factors making for political polarization and making our debt problem more challenging, to put it in the most antiseptic possible terms.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit gloomy, but I'm not sure whether Kovan has other questions. I'm pretty pleased to hear your answers. Yeah.
I think the first question that comes to mind for me is, when we think of this in the perspective of countries outside of the US, how do smaller developing countries approach debt? What are the frameworks that they use that are different from the ones that we should be using domestically? And how has that played out historically?
So historically, smaller developing countries haven't been able to, their governments have not been able to borrow at home because they don't have a population of reasonably prosperous investors to borrow from. So they borrow abroad. They hook up with an underwriting bank in London or, come the 20th century, New York, and they float foreign bonds. And historically, the problem with that has been you're borrowing in someone else's currency. So if your currency loses value, depreciates against the dollar, all of a sudden the same debts have become much more burdensome. So that can be a big liability. And that's one reason why smaller developing countries, going back to the 19th century, have a history of serial default, of having to suspend payments on their external debts. Since the Asian financial crisis at the end of the 1990s, developing countries have made strenuous efforts to develop markets in domestic currency denominated bonds, something we would all applaud, but they still, in many cases, rely heavily on foreign investors. And those foreign investors are apt to cut and run when they have a peso denominated bond, and they worry about not only about whether the issuing government will pay, but also about whether the peso will lose value, depreciate on the foreign exchange market. So they're subject to a double whammy, and they tend to cut and run as a result, creating problems for the small developing country. So right now, those problems are coming big time because of the additional debts that small developing countries have been forced to incur in order to meet the challenge of COVID, and the headwinds they're now going to face with a more slowly growing global economy, more slowly growing trade, et cetera, et cetera. We haven't done enough, the global policy community, for them.
It seems like the US has the opposite problem because of the dollar is such a global currency, as you said in your other book. And it seems the US government can issue unlimited amount of debt and someone's almost gonna buy anyway.
So I pride myself on being able to get through talks like this without uttering the phrase modern monetary theory. But you have to be a modern monetary theorist to believe the US can issue debt in its own currency in unlimited amounts. There are limits, and there will come a point where foreign central banks and investors will hesitate to swallow more US government dollar denominated bonds because they don't know whether they're going to hold their value or not. So there is an argument that because there's this captive demand abroad, foreign central banks hold their reserves in US Treasury bills and the like. The Treasury faces a lower interest rate than it would otherwise, and it's tempted to issue more than it would otherwise. When I look at that effect, it's quantitatively relatively small, but it is there.
I think we should move to questions in the Q&A. We have 4 pretty pressing questions, and I think if anyone else has any additional questions, please feel free to drop them in there. So our first question is, who are the major holders of US public debt? Does a significant foreign ownership pose a risk to the US ability to make national security decisions?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I haven't looked comprehensively at the data recently, but I conjecture that the single largest foreign holder of US public debt is the People's Bank of China. So foreign central banks are big holders, and foreign private financial institutions, sovereign wealth funds, and investment funds and the like hold US treasuries as well. Second part of the question, does significant foreign ownership pose a risk to US ability to make national security decisions? So imagine aggressive action by China against Taiwan, and imagine the White House and Pentagon deciding to sail the Pacific Fleet toward the Straits. Could China, in the same way that Putin can insinuate that he's going to cut off gas deliveries to Germany, could the PBOC insinuate that it would dump US treasuries big time, causing the kind of chaos in the treasury market we saw in March of 2020 when COVID broke out? And the answer is, of course, yes and no. Yes, they could do that, but no, they probably wouldn't, because they'd be shooting themselves in the foot. They would start to sell off their US treasuries, and as a result, they would incur big losses on their remaining holdings. So, it's just like Putin and the gas. He could cut off gas to Western Europe, but he would be damaging the revenues of Gazprom and his other friends.
Awesome. For the next question, we have a fun quote from Keynes. Keynes is quoted as saying, "The difference between a large and very large internal debt should make a scarcely appreciable difference." 1, how is this justified? And then 2, what about external debt?
Yeah, so that quote comes from my book, among other places. So somebody has been doing their reading. Thank you. So Keynes was saying that in the 1920s, Britain had come out of World War I, again, very heavily indebted. If I recall the figures, again, with a debt north of 150% of GDP. And there was a debate going on at the time about austerity measures. To what extent should the government raise taxes and cut public spending in order to retire that debt? And Keynes was saying not so fast. He was, I think, making the case for those public spending programs, among other things. And he was suggesting that the public debt levels that Britain had in the 1920s did not bode disaster. In the event, despite the Great Depression, they did not bode disaster. So even though Britain had an economic crisis and GDP went down for a couple of years, there was not a debt default, and the government was not otherwise hamstrung in terms of ability to spend. As I said before, external debt can be another issue. External debt historically has been denominated in someone else's currency, the currency of the external investors, which creates problems for you as a borrower, or now today when it's increasingly denominated in your own currency, pesos, or I'm using here as a stand-in, it can also create problems because of the tendency for investors to cut and run.
For our next question, we have a more prescriptive question, which is, do you believe that the United States would benefit from a political stalemate resulting in default?
No. I think default, which could occur through, for the last decade, we've had those imbroglios over the debt ceiling, and would we raise the debt ceiling? And if not, would we stop paying interest to the bondholders? Actions like that, or worse, default covers many sins, would damage the creditworthiness of the federal government for a long time going forward. It would damage the international standing, financial, and underscore that the United States was politically, financially dysfunctional. I think it would have a variety of deleterious domestic and international consequences.
For our next question, we have, do you anticipate the interest on US debt becoming problematically significant part of US expenditures in the near future, especially given the seeming addiction to deficit spending on the part of both major political parties? If so, what are the consequences of this?
That brings us back to the discussion Bob and I were having earlier about interest rates. So it all depends on what happens to interest rates. As I said before, I can imagine that the downward trend in interest rates will turn around and that they will begin to trend modestly upward. I find it hard to imagine that interest rates will shoot up to early 1980s Paul Volcker era levels. So if they only trend up modestly, and I think the Congress has shown pretty clearly that it doesn't have a political appetite for lots more deficit spending. If those two previous statements are correct, then no, I do not see a serious problem going forward. What I worry about is if we have to raise, if we have to do again what we did in 2020/2021 and issue a whole lot more debt in order to finance big deficits in response to the next emergency, then I become worried.
So it's about the capacity that we no longer have because of.
That's my perspective. I think of debt from kind of a risk management point of view. The Fed talks about a risk management approach to monetary policy. And I think we have to ponder what kind of risks are coming down the pike in general, and what kind of risks there are to our financial position in particular.
I think to expand on that question, do you think that there's any implicit pressure on the Fed to keep interest rates low, just from a debt perspective? It's a more conspiratorial question, but something that I think has been floated around recently is,
One could imagine such pressure in the future if debt loads were heavier and interest rates were higher, and we faced a serious trade-off between debt service on the one hand and other public priorities on the other hand. Right now, I don't see it because I think because interest rates are simply still so low. And if you look at the TIPS market and other things, people expect them to to stay low. I think the argument can be made more plausibly for the European Central Bank, where it has to worry about debt of 200% of GDP in Greece, and it has to worry about debt of 140% of GDP in Italy, economies that don't grow to a first approximation. Even there, I think the case is exaggerated because the ECB makes policy with the entire Eurozone in mind and not only Italy and Greece in mind.
So for another fun question, should the US fund its climate change policy through the use of public debt or through increased taxes such as a carbon tax?
Right, so my view is that productive public investments that grow the economy, that you're borrowing now to invest, and by borrowing you raise the debt, but by investing productively you raise the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio, and the overall burden scaled by the size of the economy doesn't go up. If borrowing to invest in climate change abatement makes the economy significantly larger than it would have been otherwise, either because we avoid climate-related disasters or because we become global leaders in exporting green technology, then I think borrowing to invest in climate change abatement is prudent. On the other hand, if you think that what we have to do things to prevent climate change problems that will not also grow the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio, then we can't borrow to make those investments. We have to pay for them as we go through the likes of a carbon tax.
So for our final question in the QA, of the trillions of expenditures annually, do you know if there's a task force devoted to solely reducing the sovereign debt? Would this be a popular campaign promise?
So there is no governmental task force of which I'm aware. There are NGOs like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which has been around since 1981. They try to raise public consciousness of the dire consequences of the present debt, and they try to lobby Congress and others to move in the direction of faster debt consolidation. I don't agree with many of their positions. If you contrast their webpage with my book, that will become evident enough, although there is a little bit of overlap between us in this need to restore the ability to borrow point. Would this be a popular campaign promise? I think what's popular, of course, is railing against the excesses of government. What's unpopular is specifying exactly what you would cut, whose favored public programs you would cut, and whose taxes you would raise. So in terms of generalities, yes. When you get to specifics, clearly no. And one would hope that campaigns ultimately revolve around specifics.
Ideally. Well, I think that's it for questions that we have. Oh, actually, one just, well, never mind. It was a question that said great program, so that is always a good sign. But thank you so much, Dr. Eichengreen, for your time. I think this is an extremely fruitful conversation. I think definitely learned a lot. I don't know, Pap, if you have any thoughts as well, but yeah.
I personally learn a lot from this talk. It's one of the most productive 1 hour I've had in my, in my week or in a long time. So thank you so much for, sparing time for us.
Most welcome. Next time in person.
Absolutely.
I hope soon.
Okay.
Well, I hope everyone has a great evening. Yep.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.